Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Mike Babin, and I'm the president of the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. And I'm proud to say that my father, Alfred Babin of the Royal Rifles of Canada, was a Hong Kong veteran. Tonight's topic centers on POW camp experiences, and we'll get to it and our speaker, Nathan Greenfield, in a moment. But first, just a reminder about how this session is going to work. Your camera and microphone are off, but you can ask questions at any time by using the chat function of Zoom. You may have to tap your screen to make it appear. You can type your questions as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentation. Your questions won't be answered right away, but will be when Nathan has finished his talk. And a note, we are recording this event, and the recording will be available on the HKVCA website. That's www.hkvca.ca. And please do recommend it to your family and friends. And now to tonight's program. Tonight's presenter is Nathan M Greenfield. Nathan is an historian and journalist living in Ottawa. He's the author of 7 military histories, 4 of which deal with prisoners of war. His book, The Damned, The Canadians at the Battle of Hong Kong and the POW Experience, 1941 to 45, was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. He has written on Canadian POWs in the First World War and Canadian POWs in Europe in the Second World War. And this month, his book, Hanged in Medicine Hat, Murders in a Nazi Prisoner of War Camp and the Disturbing True Story of Canada's Last Mass Execution, was published. Now, I expect that most of you are familiar with the Battle of Hong Kong and know about the appalling treatment of Canadian POWs during their 3 years and 8 months of captivity. Nathan's presentation this evening will look at how that experience differed from that of other Canadian POWs in World War II and that of enemy POWs interned in Canada. So now, Nathan, I'll turn the stage over to you. I'll get your slides up here.
Thank you. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah. They can.
They can. Okay, that's good. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Mike. It is my great pleasure and honor to do this talk. We have had a lovely chat before, and sure we'll have a lovely chat after, and hopefully you'll find the presentation in the middle to be of great interest. All right, without further ado, our topic tonight is Canadian prisoners of war in Europe and Japan and German prisoners of war in comparison perspective. I will not be doing the Canadian POW experience in Japan in great detail. I know most of you know many of the details. I'll be using it in many cases as a jumping off point to be talking about the situation in Europe in either of the 2 wars, the world wars, and then also the German POWs in Canada. Just one point of explanation beforehand. I will only be talking about prisoners of war, of course, not the death camps in Europe during the Second World War. So it's focusing on prisoners of war. Okay, Mike? Okay, some numbers. People always ask me about the numbers. In the First World War, there were approximately 3,800 Canadian prisoners of war in Europe. Which is not a surprising number. The largest group was captured at Second Ypres, which is also not overly surprising. There were about 300 captured on the Somme and attendant battles. In the Second World War, there were about 9,000, and that number includes airmen, soldiers captured, of course, after the invasion of Italy and France, and sailors. It also includes a very special group of prisoners of war, which we'll get to later, a group one wouldn't have expected. The largest group of Canadian prisoners of war in Second World War is, of course, was Dieppe, and then Hong Kong. So Second World War includes both. Okay, German prisoners of war in Canada in the Second World War, a stunning number of approximately 35,000. And then the two largest groups were in Medicine Hat and Lethbridge POW camps, approximately 12,000 each. The figure of 12,000 is just a bit higher than the population of Medicine Hat, which was about 13,250 in 1940. So the POW camp in Medicine Hat doubled the size of the city. Next. Okay. So legal regimen. First World War Canadian, legal regimen. First World War Canadian POWs were under the Hague Treaty of 1907. Now, there aren't a whole lot of differences when it comes to prisoners of war between the Hague Treaty and the Geneva Convention. There are some minor differences. The most important differences have to do with how wars are to be fought, and the banning of deleterious gases, that is to say, gas warfare. In the Second World War, Canadian POWs in Europe were under the Geneva Convention of 1929, and German POWs in Canada in the Second World War were also under the Geneva Convention of 1929. We're going to spend a bit of time parsing what the Geneva Convention was and the Hague Treaty and how it functioned as legal documents or legal regimens during the war. Canadian POWs in Hong Kong and Japan were not under the Geneva Convention. What's the next one? Yes, next one, please. Japan had not signed the convention, infamously, and for a number of reasons. First, under Japanese military law, surrender was illegal, and that created a problem with signing the convention, because one of the things the convention does, and the Hague Treaty did also, is it recognizes the perseverance of military law after surrender, and also before the importance of military law beforehand. So there would be a logical contradiction between Japan signing the convention when its own military law said that surrender was illegal. Now, I am not defending Japan here, not at all. I want to lay out some of the legal issues. The expectation that Japan would follow Geneva, however, was based on a statement by a Japanese diplomat in South America a few weeks before 7-8 December and the beginning of the Second World War in the Far East. The diplomat has never been named, although there are several references to him. The statement had no legal impact, as much as we might deplore that. It had, because Geneva required the signature of a government, and a statement by a diplomat is simply not a signature of a government. The fact that Japan did not sign the Geneva Convention in no way excuses its appalling treatment of all the prisoners it took in the Second World War. Again, I'm simply trying to sketch out the legal background here. Next. Soviet Russia had not signed Geneva either, which gave Nazi Germany a legal, and I put that in quotation marks or scare quotes, way of ignoring Geneva's provisions. So even though Nazi Germany had signed Geneva in relation to the Western powers, because they had signed Geneva, including Canada, signed Geneva, Russia did not. And the Geneva Convention, at the time, its logic was that you were, as a government, let us say Canada, you were beholden to the rules of Geneva if with vis-a-vis German POWs, because Nazi Germany had signed the Geneva Convention. This is diplomatic law, not morality. Of the 5.7 million Russians captured approximately, by January 1945, there were only 930,000 left alive. So you can do the math. The death rate was astounding. By comparison, the death rate of the approximately 231,000 British Empire POWs in Japan was about, in Germany, was about 3.6%, or around 8,000. Most died of disease or wounds. Now, there were Western POWs, and the most famous group were the 50 who were executed after the Great Escape. So Western POWs who were executed illegally by the Germans. Similarly, there was the Canadians who were captured in Normandy and were executed after they had surrendered at the Abbaye Ardennes, and that was a war crime and it was punished. But the vast majority of the 8,000 who died in German hands were from disease or wounds. Interestingly, that figure, the 3.6%, is not all that far off of the death rate in the general population in the 1920s. And I use the 1920s to get us out of the issue of the Great Depression for men of that age. And that is to say, men who would be killed in accidents, in farm accidents, industrial accidents as minors. It's not all that different. It's about 0.6% different. Russia captured approximately 3.6 million Germans, of which 1.1 million died in their POW camps. Now, one of the differences between the Russian experience in Germany and the German experience in Russia is that Russia held hundreds of thousands of German POWs for several years after the war, who were used more or less as slave laborers. So again, neither country, having signed Geneva, neither even pretended to abide by its rules. Next. Okay. This Geneva prisoner treatment, and this applies to the Hague Treaty also. Battlefield medicine. That is to say that wounded soldiers so let's say the Canadians wounded at Second Ypres or on the Somme, the Germans were required to care for them in exactly the same way in battlefield conditions as they would have their own wounded men, and vice versa. On the whole, we can say this was followed. We'll see an example where it wasn't in a bit. But on the whole, the Germans did administer battlefield medicine. It mattered very often which battle, where you were physically in the battle and where the battle was in its time span. An important part of both Geneva and the Hague Treaty is removal from the battlefield, and that is to say quickly. Under the Geneva and the Hague Treaty, the detaining power, which is the name given to the country that captures you in Geneva and in the Hague, was required to remove you from the battlefield as quickly as possible. Now that again, as quickly as possible, varied greatly on the battlefield conditions, weather in some cases, how far into the war the battle took place, and that mattered because the further into each of the First and Second World Wars, the more the German system of battlefield medicine broke down. On the contrary, the British armies, of which Canada was one, the longer the war continued, the more developed battlefield medicine became. So the stretcher bearers were better trained. They, of course, in the Second World War, they had, at the beginning of the war, they had sulfur, and towards the end of the war, they had penicillin. They had sulfur, of course, also in the First World War. So in the battlefield medicine in each war on the German side declined, and it declined greatly in each war. Under the Hague Treaty and Geneva, I'll just call it the Hague. Under the Hague and Geneva, a prisoner was in the control of the army that captured him, not the personnel who captured him. So flowing from that was the no pilfering law. That is to say, you soldiers who captured a Canadian or Canadians who captured a German were forbidden to pilfer personal items. Now, that was not generally followed when it came to insignia, often buttons. The Canadians on the whole followed it when it came to personal items such as wallets, pictures. Germans also on the whole followed it. Often what happened if a man was injured and on the ground, he would take out his wallet, and if it had a picture of his wife or his girlfriend or his mother or his kids, would hold that picture so it could be seen by the capturing army as a way of forming some kind of a personal connection with the personnel of the capturing army. Of course, the word comrade was used, hands being up, and the surrender often being said with the word comrade. Now, once we moved from the battlefield, POWs in both wars under the Hague Treaty, under Geneva, were required to be given the same food as garrison troops nearby. Now, that's an interesting term, garrison troops nearby, because defined nearby. The purpose of that was, of course, to make sure that soldiers did not starve. And the Germans, on the whole, did not follow it in either war in the way it was intended. The way it was intended was that you would receive food or foodstuff so your cooks could cook, as in Hogan's Heroes. The food was given to the men, and the Red Cross parcels, which of course was so important for the survival of the Hong Kong, the men captured by the Japanese in Hong Kong, was supposed to be extra. So the caloric intake was supposed to be through the food given by the detaining power. The Germans, on the whole, did not follow that. They included the caloric intake of the Red Cross parcels in the caloric intake of the prisoners. So it basically, they gave them less than garrison troops nearby, topped up by Red Cross parcels. Obviously, as almost, I'm sure everybody here knows, Japanese barely gave enough to survive. A handful of rice, as many men told me, and very, very small amounts of protein, if any protein at all, for long periods. And the Red Cross parcels were often housed by the Japanese, taken by the Japanese, stored by the Japanese, and not given to the Canadians or British or American prisoners of war, with the result, as I'm sure you all know, of starvation by Western troops and diseases that follow from starvation. The German troops in Canada, and we'll get to whom they are in a moment, but I might as well cover this here. I think it's on the next slide, but it doesn't matter. They were, again, the Canadians gave them the same caloric intake as the garrison troops nearby, plus the Red Cross parcels, which were delivered regularly, with the result that the average German POW in medicine hats put on 11 pounds in the first year. Under the Hague and Geneva, pay was the same ranks as the country holding you, and you received your pay regularly into a special account. In the case, I know a bit more about what happened here in Canada. The Germans had bank accounts, special bank accounts set up for them. the receiver general sent their pay into that account, and they were able to withdraw a certain amount each month. Labor could be required of ordinary ranks, but not slave labor, as in Japan. Labor that could be required would be cleaning up the camp, building new huts, and the like. So basically, the upkeep of the camp. You could not be, and no, in Canada, no POWs were sent out of the camp to work. Now, we'll get to what happened to the Canadians in Germany in both World Wars in a few minutes. Under both Hague and Geneva, the POWs chose their own camp leaders. In the by-election, and those elections occurred here in Canada too. The German POWs elected their camp leaders, and that we'll also deal with in a few moments because it created a problem vis-a-vis controlling the men. Mail was extraordinarily important for prisoners of war, as again, I'm sure everybody who's listening knows for the men in Hong Kong. It gave a sense of connection to home, even if the letters were delayed. Letters between Canada and Germany in both world wars could take between 6 weeks to 6 months to arrive, somewhat usually within 3 months. They traveled from Canada to neutral Sweden or Turkey, and then on to Germany. Mail was censored going in, going out in both countries. That is to say, Canadians censored the German POWs mail leaving Canada, and the Germans censored it coming in to Germany, and they censored going out of Germany, and we censored it coming into Canada. Set up a bit of a cat and mouse game between the writers of letters and postcards and the censors, and there are reports of POWs families writing back in both cases, Germany to here to Germany in both wars, writing back to a prisoner of war saying that the censor has changed because different things are being censored. And I've handled a number of letters for the actual letters, not copies of them, where there's this, well, it's now dried, of course, but it was then a very sticky, gummy ink that sort of soaked into the paper and really did make it impossible to read what was underneath. You can get around it a bit now with x-rays. I didn't have access to that, but I have seen some stuff on it. The other thing with mail that was particularly important was that it gave the camp leadership extraordinary power over their own men, because it was the camp leadership in both Germany and here that distributed the mail. So if you had fallen into the bad books of the camp leadership here in, let's say, Medicine Hat or Lethbridge or Ozata or Nye, Ontario, or for that matter, the POW camp just across the road from me here in Ottawa, in Hull, and a POW camp where Man in His World is now in Montreal. If you had fallen into the bad books of the camp leaders, they could withhold your mail, and there was nothing that the Canadians could do about that. Next. Okay, German POWs in Canada. Why? Anyone want to guess? Or I'll just Mike, if anybody gives a guess, give me 2 of them.
Nobody's daring to guess.
Nobody's daring to guess. Well, the first reason is it's very far from Germany. The second, Britain could not house them because, especially after the American soldiers arrived, food was a problem. Almost all of Britain's food had to be shipped to Britain across the U-boat infested North Atlantic, and that created a problem. If you have hundreds of thousands of German POWs, you have to feed them. So there was no keeping them in Britain was no go for basically for the beginning. The vast majority were in South Africa. There was some sent to Australia, and Canada, as I said, held 35,000. Others were held in Egypt and elsewhere in British Middle East. And then there's the escape possibilities. If you escaped the POW camp in Britain, let's say, you stood some possibility of getting back to occupied Europe. Not easy, just about as hard as Canadian POWs who escaped the Germans and had to cross the channel to get back to Britain. Not easy, but not impossible. The escape possibilities from Canada were basically nil. So, for example, if you were in the POW camp in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and you escaped in the winter, you would die. If you were in the POW camp in Medicine Hat, Alberta, in the summer, you escaped, you got lost to the wheat fields in southern Alberta. You simply had no way of getting anywhere. The only way in and out of many of the POW camps was by train, and the Canadians were able to monitor the train tracks quite well. There were escapes from a couple of POW camps in the Maritimes, and there was a escape, although the Canadians knew he was escaping and allowed him to escape, of a German U-boatman from Bowmanville. And the reason they allowed that escape to go forward is they wanted to try to seize the U-boat in the Bay de Chaleur. They failed, but he was recaptured. There was almost no way of getting anywhere. If you got to Vancouver, wonderful. Where do you go? If you got to Halifax, what's your plan? So that's wasn't an option. There was one escape from Canada before the U.S. enters the war. So a guy, airman named Werner, they made a movie out of him called The One That Got Away. He escaped from a train, again, not very far from where I am, near Kingston, New York, crossed the frozen St. Lawrence, and turned himself in the neutral United States to the first policeman he could find. And he was given asylum because the US was neutral. He was feted at the German embassy. He then goes to Mexico to try to get back to Germany. He does, and he dies about 6 months later on a bombing mission. Next. Okay, Hague and Geneva on escaping. Everybody always wants to know about how this worked. Well, escaping we'll get to later, but the legal issues are interesting. Both the Hague Treaty and the Convention allowed for escaping. And this is extraordinarily important for what happens in Medicine Hat, Alberta, with the killings of two Germans, each one in 43 and one in 44. And the argument, which I'll get into more detail later, but the argument that since the Hague Treaty allowed escaping, and military law, both, as I say, German military law and British military law mandated escaping, that when you were in a POW camp, you remained under the military law of your home army. And so that's extraordinarily important. And it's one of the reasons why the executions of the men of the 50 of the escapees who were caught after the Great Escape, why their execution was a war crime. Because it was legal under the convention, and by the convention allowing it, it recognized the military law under which Canadians served, and the British armies. And for that matter, Americans, because the Americans there. Another example of how the two treaties recognize the legality of escaping, both have sections of dealing with punishment for escaping, or to be probably more precise, for a failed escape. And in practice, that was usually 30 days in solitary confinement. It varied. but in general, it was about 30 days. Sometimes on bread and water, not always. Escaping had two functions. What's the next slide, Mike? No. Okay, go back. Escaping had two important functions in the First and Second World Wars in Europe. One of them was not actually getting men back to fight again, because in fact, very few who escaped successfully did fight again. If they were airmen, they were put on training because they knew how to escape a burning bomber, for the most part. The other reason why is that you didn't want to take the risk of the Germans recapturing a man who had escaped, completely escaped, left the country, and him falling back in the German hands again. The Germans, of course, captured many escapers. We just discussed that in terms of punishing failed escape attempts. The main reason escaping was important, two main reasons. One was because it used up resources of the detaining government. So after the Great Escape, they mobilized 10,000 soldiers to track down the escapers. Now, that doesn't change the course of the war, those 10,000. But it does use up a lot of resources, German resources. Those resources are used up even before escaping. So, for example, here at Medicine Hat, there were the guards, and there were also people called scouts. Those were guards who searched the huts, looking for escape materials, looking for guns if they had somehow smuggled one in, looking for maps, that sort of thing. And all of that uses up manpower. It's manpower that can't be put somewhere else. So that's the first reason why your home army wants you to be a possible escaper, because it forces the detaining country to expend resources to prevent you from escaping or capture you if you have escaped. The second reason is morale. It was very, very good for morale for POWs in Europe and POWs in Canada to be trying to escape. It gave them something to do. It gave them the feeling that they were still, I like to put it off the chessboard, but still men at war. It gave them a mission. They were, of course, extraordinarily inventive with ways of escaping. So it kept their morale intact. It gave the leadership, the command leadership in the camp, something to give their men to do. And it gave the hope, well, maybe I might actually get out of here. So those are the two reasons why the home army wants you to be an incipient escaper, or to at least be perceived as one. Next. Now, escaping in Japanese military law. Putting aside the fact that any Western soldier who might escape from Japanese camps in Hong Kong and Japan proper would not have been able to hide in the general population, the situation was very, very different. As noted, the Geneva Convention did not apply. Japanese military law allowed extreme sentences, including the death penalty, for violating any number of parts of the Japanese military code. Escaping was considered akin to mutiny and therefore merited the death sentence, which under The Hague and under Geneva, it did not. So those are two important differences between the situation in Japan. I'm not even getting into the fact that the starving men and beaten men would barely have been able to summon up the energy to escape. That's a different discussion. We can discuss that if you want to ask questions about it. We can, or we can discuss it at a later date. But in terms of the legal situations, entirely different. Next. laws and life inside the wire. Okay, I don't know how many of you saw that in the paper the other day that Corporal LeBeau, I forgot his real name, from the last of Hogan's Heroes, the little French guy who was the cook, died last week. Fascinating story. He was in Buchenwald. He was Jewish. He was in Buchenwald, and most of his family died at Auschwitz. And because he was in Buchenwald as an internee, he of course he died with a tattoo of number on his arm. Ironic that was in the news because Hogan's Heroes, which I've discussed in the last couple of days a few times, gets a whole heck of a lot of things right about POW camps holding Western servicemen and Germans held in Canada. Now, yes, it is situation comedy. There are some things that would never have occurred. As you see, there was no international huts until the very end of the war in Germany, when essentially the POW camp system had broken down. But there was the perseverance of the command structure. So Commandant Klink gives an order to Sergeant Schultz, the hapless Sergeant Schultz, as he was called in the newspaper, who gives it to Colonel Hogan, who gives it to whomever. So very rarely does a commandant give an order to a POW. It did happen, but it was not usual. The orders go through a German command structure or through a Canadian command structure to the ranking officer in the POW camp. In the POW camps here in Canada, they were called the man of confidence. The POWs did their own cooking, as Corporal LeBeau shows us. Carmen Jackson, who was a guard in Ozata POW camp in Alberta, it was a temporary camp that held about 12,000 men in 1942. And he recalls having the best Christmas dinner he ever had at that camp. The guards in almost all the POW camps in Canada were quite envious of the German the food. The Germans ate not just because they had lots of it, which the guards did too, but because many of the German POWs were professional cooks, and to put it gently, the men who cooked in for the guards were not. The POWs ran their own education programs inside the wire. Now, inside the wire is a term I should explain. POW camps in Germany and in Canada, so you have this, the fence or stockade, depending upon the structure, and then at about maybe 10 feet out from the fence, at about ankle length, maybe shin high or ankle high, there's a wire that was run. It's not electrical. It was just there. If you stepped over the wire, that's why we're going inside the wire, you were liable to be shot on sight. That would be considered attempting to escape, and you could be stopped. That did not happen in Canada. It did happen a few times in Germany. Because the German POWs were soccer mad, almost every German soldier was equipped with a white flag, which if he had to step over the wire to get the soccer ball, he would wave. And he'd be allowed to get the soccer ball and then step back over the wire. The wire, inside the wire, that area, which, acres large, was considered contested territory. The Germans considered it German territory, and they pointed to things like their own military law that allowed them to discipline, their own education programs, their own commanders. We'll get to that in a bit more detail in a few moments. But the Germans also ran their own education programs, and in Canada, we also ran them. We ran education programs so well that we sent the final exams to Germany to get marked by German professors and sent back to Canada. I saw a picture when I wrote my first book on the Battle of the St. Lawrence. I did not save the picture, and I have always kicked myself for it, of a German officer receiving his degree, a BA, from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, crossing the stage in full SS uniform. It had even a new SS uniform had been sent to him so he could receive his degree properly. As we said before, pay was for the same rank and paid to work outside the camp. The POWs in Canada who worked outside the camp, their working conditions were examined and approved by the Canadian Department of Labor that set the labor rates at essentially the same rate as labor in the area. The reason why it had to be the same rate as labor in the area was because if it were not, there was concern that there would be strikes. Discipline. It's a very complicated question, which we will get to in some more detail in a few moments. All I want to say here is that discipline was, because it's a contested area inside the POW camp, discipline was also a contested and legally fraught area, especially after the killings at the Medicine Hat POW camp. Next. Okay, there were mistreatments. I don't want to give any impression that being a POW was a walk in the park. It was not. In Europe, was a walk in the park. As we've said, there killings after the Great Escape. First World War mistreatments. Arthur Gibbons, and I think his picture is next. So let's go to the next one and just bring up his picture. No, go to one more, Mike. All right, we'll get to it. The picture's gone missing. Arthur Gibbons, wounded at Ypres, and he, unlike what should have happened, that's April 1915, the first gas attack. Unlike what should have happened, he should have been picked up from the battlefield that night after he was wounded. He was not. He was left on the battlefield for several days, and as the Germans advanced on the Canadian positions, Germans kicked him in the stomach, in his head, and perhaps more upsetting in a more horrible way, they kicked his mangled right leg. He was finally, by a German soldier, put in a wheelbarrow and taken back behind the German lines. The surgeon who operated on his mangled leg reversed the position of his foot. That is to say, when he came out of the anesthesia, his foot, instead of pointing forward, pointed backwards. Escapers, some were treated quite well upon being caught. There was an escape from Bischoffer camp, a Canadian and a Frenchman. The Canadian was dressed in widow's weeds. He had spent months sewing a widow's dress. The French young soldier who escaped with him was supposed to be her relatively, her mute son. They were buying their tickets to get closer to Denmark, and they were captured. And for a while, the Canadian POW tries to maintain that he is a woman until the Germans call women into the room to search him, at which point he, in German, says, "For God's sake, don't let them touch me. I'm a British Canadian soldier. And here are my dog tags." He was brought back to camp, and actually the commandant and he shared a shot of schnapps before he was put in the strafe cell, that is the punishment cell, for 30 days. Others, when they were captured, were beaten, which of course violated Geneva. There were no war crimes trials for this. For these beatings, but they are recorded both in personal memoirs and in military documents. The punishments for escaping sentences were legal, but the forced labor in unsafe salt mines without protection was not. Approximately 100 Canadians were forced into one of these mines, which dated back to the 1870s. Now, this is, of course, 1916, 1917. So the 1870s is, almost 50 years ago, not 100 plus years ago. But salt mines that had not been used in 50 years were quite unsafe and had routinely had caves in. And so this was a violation of the Hague Treaty, as were the beatings for refusing to work. And in one particular case, Canadians were being beaten, and there was a convenient cave-in, and the German who was beating him was never seen again. Next. Most escapes in the First World War were to neutral Holland, though some to Switzerland. Major Peter Anderson, who was the highest-ranking Canadian to escape in the war, he captured it, went to Denmark, which was relatively easy for him because he was a Danish immigrant. So the closer he got to Denmark, the more he acted not as just a traveler, but as a Dane. He spoke German fluently, so before that he had passed himself off as a German. But as he got closer, he passed himself off as a Dane. And then he crossed the border. He got off the train at the last stop before Denmark, crossed the border at night, and because he was Danish, was managed to make his way back to Britain, where he was once again reinstated in the army. He did not fight again. POWs of MacDonald and O'Brien escaped to Holland in 1917, at least for a few minutes. And the reason why I say that is they crawled into and out of Holland. They crawled in to Holland. There was a little spit of land, so they're crawling under a German fence into Holland. They continued crawling for a while, not very long, saw no one around, stood up, started walking, and coming at them was a group of Prussian troops. There was this little spit of land, and they had crawled right back into Germany. Private Simmons and Corporal Edwards. Simmons was the Canadian, Edwards a Brit. They bore the farmer no ill will. However, they had escaped twice before and been captured. On their third attempt, they were not far from the Dutch border, and they saw a farmer. They saw a farmer carrying a brace of birds that he'd shot. A little while later, they saw the farmer again with his shotgun. And though Simmons writes a memoir, they bore the farmer no ill will, they killed him. At that point, it was him or them. They killed him using a shovel. Now, what was interesting about the description of killing the farmer was there was very little description of killing the farmer in the memoir. Rather, the lines were, line was, bore the farmer no ill will, but he had to die. But while in remembering the event, and this is, of course, I trust the record, far, but I'm not sure I can trust it all the way. Simmons wrote that all of the beatings he had witnessed of Allied prisoners of war and the mistreatment of the Russians at one particular POW camp where he had seen hundreds of starving Russians, unspooled in his mind. He saw all those images, he writes, as they killed the farmer. Oh, and I told you the story of, yes, Lieutenant John Thorne and playing dress up. That was the name of the Canadian and the who went as escaped in Widow's Weeds. Next. Second World War. There are any number of escape stories and evader stories that I can tell you. I can tell you perhaps the two oddest RAF flight officer Tommy Thompson, who was a Canadian, meets a VIP in September 1939. Thompson was shot down on the second night of the war over Germany, and he is, oh, sorry, over France, and he is taken to Berlin. And he's treated relatively well. He's taken to Berlin, and he is marched onto a train, marched out of the train, doesn't go anywhere, onto a train, out of a train, through a train yard, up and down trains, till he gets to a very, very fancy train. And in that train was Hermann Goering, who wants to know about the RAF and its plans. Thompson, of course, is not telling him anything, but Goering and Airman, and Thompson and Airman sort of hit it off, and Goering promises him that he will survive the war. Later in the war, Thompson is in an escape attempt, captured, and the commandant, the officers that capture him are about to execute him. And Thompson tells the story that Goering said he would survive the war. I'm not sure who wouldn't, if you were a German soldier, take that seriously. And what they did was they contacted Berlin. And Goering said that's true. And Thompson was just brought back to the prison camp. The Oblates. The Oblates are a missionary order of the Catholic Church. Oblates, often pronounced. On 17 April 1941, there were 16 Oblate priests and teaching brothers, not 32, 16 total, on the SS Zamzam, which was a Egyptian flagged ship on its way to South Africa, and they were on their way to Botswana to be missionaries. On the night of 17 April 1941, it is overhauled by a German commerce raider and sunk. All of the people aboard the Zamzam, including a fair number of women and children, including a Canadian, one Canadian woman and her 2 children, were taken aboard the commerce raider, ultimately landed in France. And so all of the civilians, except for this Canadian woman and her children and the Oblates, were released because they're civilians. The Oblates traveled on British passports. 41, there's a war. War is almost now a year and a half old. Well, it's a year and a half. And the Germans decide that they're going to send the Oblates into the prison camp system. Now, they should have been sent into an internment camp, but they were sent into the prison camp system for a number of reasons. The most important being the Germans did not trust their own Catholic priests. So to be in the prison camps ministering to the POWs. So they sent the Oblates in. Why they would trust Canadian Catholic priests, I have no record. I could not find any reason why that would be the case, but they apparently thought that they were safer. The Oblates were a fascinating bunch. One of them, Father Philip Goudreau, ends up at Stalag Luft 3. And he was there for the digging of the tunnels that become the Great Escape. Tom, Dick, and Harry. Well, we all know about Tom and Dick, but what about Harry? Harry was a tunnel that was dug to hold equipment. The entrance to the tunnel had never been found. When I visited with my wife Stalag Luft 3, a number of years ago, we're being on the tour, and there's a building that was it looks like a stadium, and it was the building that they had built as a theater and, for sports activities. You could even see the cutouts and the dirt for the benches. And the historian of the museum, director of the museum, is telling me that this is the theater building, etc. And I said, where was the back of it? It was a little bit hard to get bearings. It was wrecked. And he goes, well, the back of it's over there. I said, oh, that's where Father Goudreau's Stella Maris, they had built a chapel. Not secret, it was known. And I said, that's where Father Goudreau's chapel, Stella Maris, was. And he said, yes, yeah. And I said, well, you mentioned something about ground search radar when we started this tour. He said, yeah, there was a ground search radar team here from Scotland a couple of weeks ago, and they were looking for Harry. And they think they found part of it. And I said, oh, well, I know where the entrance is. And they said, where? I said, if that's Stella Maris, straight ahead to the rock. And he went to get a hammer, started banging on the rock, and it was hollow. And I know that because in a short memoir that Father Goudreau wrote after the war, he wrote about having hidden the entrance to Harry behind his chapel, which would, of course, have led to his death had it been found out. He blessed the tunnels, and he also should have been one of the men executed. He was supposed to be the 71st, supposed to be the 51st man out. But because he was a priest, because of the time, how long he'd been there, because he was a priest, he said, no, let someone who has a young family go. That man was captured and executed. And it was something that Father Goudreau lived with for the rest of his life. And I met an elderly oblate when I started this research who knew Father Goudreau, and they'd been missionaries in Africa for 30 years. And he told me it was something he prayed about regularly. The oblates, there were some very other interesting stories. One of them is that they were originally sent to Marlague Nord, which was naval camp because they were captured by the Navy. And then they wanted to send them off to the POW camps. And the eldest of, there was no leader of the priests, but there was the eldest one. And he was brought into the commandant's office and given a list and said, these men are going to be sent next Thursday to these POW camps as priests. And the oblate says to him, well, what's the purpose of this? He says, so they can minister to the men. He said, well, you can't send this one, and this one. Commandant looks at him, apparently pushes down his monocle and says, why can I not? And he says, well, these three are priests, these three are teaching brothers, and they can't do the mass. What you mean they can't do the mass? He asks. And he answers, well, they have to bless the bread and the wine, and there's this whole transubstantiation. And so the priest looks and says, was ist das, this transubstantiation? At which point the oblate says, go read Martin Luther. And the commandant throws up his hands and says, fine, you choose them. They were fearless. One priest was in POW camp in near Poznan, Poland, and he snuck out of that camp to meet with other oblates nearby. Okay, next.
Now, Nathan, we're just past the 60-minute mark.
And we just passed the 60. I told you I had to go on. All right. Okay. Maybe I should go to the questions. Well, let's just go to the next slide for next, because not even halfway. Yeah. Okay. That Ian McDonald, he was shot down. the night 14/15/43. He was betrayed at the last moment into the loving arms of the Gestapo while just about getting into Spain. Okay, I'll take questions because I'm sure the questions will lead one to another.
Okay, so that's great, Nathan. Thanks very much. I'm going to take your slides down here, and I'm going to put my picture back on the screen. So now we'll see both of us. And I'm going to ask people to submit their questions. And so the way you do that, just to remind you, is to find the Q&A button on your screen, on your Zoom screen, which is probably at the bottom. You may have to touch the screen to make it come alive, and then send in your questions and answers. Now, just while people are typing in, Gail Angel earlier remarked that there was a POW camp in the Eastern Townships as well.
Yes.
Which you're probably familiar with. And
At Farnsworth, I think.
I'm sorry?
I think it was at Farnsworth, but if that's a guess on my memory.
Yeah,
but yeah, there were 28 of them dotted across the country.
Okay. And Charles Boudreau would like to know more about the French-Canadian Oblates in the POW system. And he just is not sure of the spelling. Is it Goudreau with a G or Boudreau with a
No,
B?
Goudreau with
a G.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Father Goudreau. Yes. The Philippe Goudreau. Well, they were very interesting because the Oblates were a teaching order. Even the priests, they were generally that was what they did, and they were in the camps. They provided succor to the men. They provided counseling, obviously the religious services, but they were also quite interesting. At one point, one of the Oblates writes a letter back to Canada to his to the Oblate headquarters, what was here in Ottawa until very recently, which is how I found the letters. They saying that he has a problem. He has to give him. He can't do his confession because there's no one to confess to. So he is an expert in canon law. So he appoints himself his own bishop. And as his own bishop, he gives himself absolution. And he sends this off to the head of the Oblates here in Ottawa, who okays it. He said it's perfectly fine in the circumstances. Another Oblate decides that saying Mass, which at the time was done with your back to the congregation, in that manner, in the prison camp, did not make sense. So he reversed the table and said Mass facing the congregation. Now, what's interesting about this particular Oblate, who you might guess his Latin name just fell out of my head, this particular Oblate is one of the lead Canadian theologians at Vatican II, when the Catholic Church reverses the table. He's one of the leaders arguing for that.
Wow. They sound like quite a bunch. In fact, another one of our attendees said, "I love these Oblates. I went to a Jesuit high school." Has a lot of respect for them. On a different subject, we've got a question here. Have you done any research on the effects of the Hong Kong POWs on children who are now adults? In other words, the effect of the POWs experiences in the camps. What has that done to their children? Have you done any research on that?
I haven't, and actually, that's a fascinating question because it occurs to me every now and then when I read about intergenerational transfer of trauma, which of course the most, many people might be familiar with that for the children of Holocaust survivors, and now grandchildren and great-grandchildren, or in the case of the United States, of slavery, intergenerational transfer of trauma. And that, so the idea occurs to me. I'm not that sort of a researcher. The person to do that would be would have to have a degree in, social psychology and a lot more statistics. I can't balance my checkbook, a lot more statistics than I can handle. But I imagine, just from what I've read on intergenerational transfer, that it would be similar to the other intergenerational transfers of trauma. And what would, of course, be fascinating is to compare and contrast the Hong Kong families with families of whose fathers, grandfathers were POWs in Europe.
Exactly. Well, I might just mention that there's an interesting study going on right now, or a piece of research at the War Museum in Ottawa by a fellow named Michael Petru, who has interviewed a lot of the survivors or children of POWs, not just Hong Kong POWs, but other POWs. Now, it's not a compare and contrast, rigorous, scholarly piece of work, but he's interviewing him to find out, what happened to you? What was your relationship with your father? What impact did it have on the family and so on? So the War Museum will be publishing those the results of that study sometime in the next year, I believe. So we should.
I look forward to it, and I hope someone takes up the real statistical analysis, because that would be fascinating.
Absolutely.
Health wise, and of course family relation wise.
A different question again from James. Is it true that the ruins of POW camps can still be found in Ontario along the Algoma Railway?
Yes. Yep. And you can also find at Bowmanville, there's the ruins right next to Camp X, the ruins of Camp X, and not in Montreal, because that's where Man in His World is now. They're also in New Brunswick. I don't remember which camp that was, but I visited it a couple of years ago, and you can still see the sort of layout of it. Medicine Hat, no, because it's where the Stampede is, Medicine Hat Stampede. Lethbridge, no. And Ozeta, there are no ruins because it was a temporary camp. It was only there for the summer, and it was mainly tents.
Okay. Are any of these turned into a historical site? I mean, is there
one in New Brunswick? There's a small historical site there, and it's not far from Dieppe, New Brunswick. The others, no, because they've been paved over. That they've so there wouldn't be anything to. I mean, you could put up a plaque, and there may well be, for all I know.
Okay. All right, so do we have any more questions? We have quite a few people who have not asked a question, Nathan, but they said very interesting, looking forward to reading your new book. Thank you very much for your presentation and more along those lines.
No, that's
we even have one fellow in Hong Kong, Martin in Hong Kong, who's giving greetings and thanking you for your presentation.
Thank you. If I have enough time, I can give a 10-minute précis on the book.
Well, why don't you? We have one more question here.
Oh, yes.
From Andy. Do you know much about the group of German POWs who volunteered to work in the pulp camps in Northern Ontario?
Yep, they volunteered to work in the pulp plants and had a great time doing so, because they were able to. They were out. A lot of them were living with families because there wasn't a camp there. In fact, there was a large number of German POWs who couldn't be repatriated. There was actually maybe one particular group. They're going to repatriate them. They post the list on the on the fence or whatever. These 200 shipping out back to Germany on Tuesday, and the amount of confidence goes into the commandant says you cannot repatriate him, and him. Why not? They're married and have children.
Okay.
They were working on farms. So do you want to be the assistant deputy minister who goes to the deputy minister in November 1945 and says, "Sir, we have a problem"?
Interesting problem indeed. Well, why don't you take a moment and talk about
Okay, so the book is Hang the Medicine Hat. It tells the story of the killings, essentially for defeatism, of one POW in 43, one POW in 44. In 44, they also thought he was a traitor. They were right, but didn't know that. They didn't have the evidence. And then the investigations between 43 and the end of the war, and 44 and the end of the war for the second one. The case was broken in 40, shortly after the end of the war, when an anonymous letter was left on a typewriter at Nines, Ontario POW camp, naming names. That then led to the trials. And the trials on April 46 of the first one man is executed, and in later in 46 for the other of the execution of Carl Lehman by four Germans, and they were executed, and it was the last mass hanging in Canadian history on December 26, 1946. What's interesting, and I was set this up, obviously didn't have time to work it out, is the issue of the contested issue inside the wire. The Germans claim that because of all the legal reasoning I had set out, they controlled inside the wire, and these men were traitors. And especially Lehman, who's executed after Hitler issues the bomb plot, issues the order after the bomb plot in 44, saying liquidate all traitors. They considered him a traitor and considered themselves under orders to liquidate him. So the book deals, so it tells the killings, the investigation, and the trials, and the courtroom drama where the defense, especially in the second set, is trying to argue that the land inside the wire doesn't operate according to normal Canadian criminal law.
Well, that plays into a question that actually James asked. To what extent was there Nazi discipline in the camps in Canada? I think you're
very strong.
Exactly that question.
The men who led the camps, in most cases, they were Nazified, and they called themselves the Gestapo. And we knew that and allowed it.
Now, Nathan, do you have a copy of your book to hold up?
I do have a copy of the book to hold up.
Okay, and where can one?
It is available. If it came out last week, week before last. It is available on Chapters, Amazon, and it should be available in the finer bookstores near you.
Okay, great. Well, Nathan, thank you very much. As I said, lots of feedback, positive feedback on your presentation. So thank you very much.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
And I just want to mention that our next event is about the Battle of Hong Kong Spatial History Project. And you may be asking yourself, what is spatial history? It's an easy-to-use interactive web map about the Battle of Hong Kong and a database of military installations in Hong Kong during the Second World War. This contains a treasure trove of information about how the battle unfolded from minute to minute, in fact, and the soldiers on both sides with biographical material about the soldiers and so on. So very interesting. So this event will be on Monday, January the 16th at 7:30 Eastern Time. And you'll all be receiving an email about the beginning of January telling you about that. So that's our next event. I would also recommend that you watch the live streaming of the annual commemorative ceremony in Hong Kong that's put on by the Consulate of Canada in Hong Kong. So the first Sunday of every December, they hold this event, and because of COVID and so on, they've begun live streaming it. So it will be live streamed this year. So it's on Sunday morning in Hong Kong, but that's Saturday evening here for most of Canada. So that's 9 o'clock on Saturday evening on December the 2nd, December the 3rd, I should say. But just check our website, www.hkvca.ca, and you'll find out how to connect to this event and more about it. So everybody, thank you very much for joining in. Thanks again, Nathan. And that's the end of our presentation for tonight. And hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.